Happy Thursday morning, everybody. Welcome to reading. What you need is your copy of I Survived the American Revolution. We are reading chapters 13 and 14 today. You will also need your chapter 13 and 14 discussion questions. And when we are finished with this, we have read 10 through 14, and it's time for your chapter quiz. All right. Follow along with me either in your actual book or on the computer with me as I read chapters 13 and 14 of I Survived the American Revolution. When we left off, Nate had gotten the job taking care of the camp, and we learned a little bit more about him. He heard his friend James in the tent dying of smallpox. And what we learn about Nate is that he had already had it. Him and Eliza and Theo back at Storch's farm, they all had smallpox already. And once you have smallpox, your body builds an immunity to it. So he was able to go in and comfort James just before he died, which I think made Paul, and I'm sure James, feel at least a little bit better. So here we are, chapter 13. August 25th, 1776, and let's notice where we are now. We're in Brooklyn. And what do we know about that first chapter? Right, that Nate was in Brooklyn when the Battle of Brooklyn began. So let's see what's going to happen here. 3 days later, the Connecticut 5th was ordered to Brooklyn, along with 6,000 other soldiers. They were all ferried across the East River on big rowboats. Nate and the men were sent to Fort Greene, one of the 6 Brooklyn forts. All of the forts were spread across Brooklyn Heights. That was the part of Brooklyn that was closest to New York City. Nate didn't realize how huge Brooklyn was. It had to be at least 10 times the size of New York City, and much of the land was wild. Only a few hundred people lived in Brooklyn, and most had fled. But this wild land was important in the war. If the British took Brooklyn, they would put their cannons on Brooklyn Heights. From there, they could blast New York City to bits. "But we're not going to let that happen," Captain Marsh said. It was a few hours after they'd arrived at Fort Greene. Nate and the men had set up their tents inside the fort's tall dirt walls. Now Captain Marsh was explaining the American battle plan. He showed them a map of Brooklyn and pointed out the 6 American forts. Then Captain Marsh pointed to a squiggly line on the map. It looked to be about 1 mile from Brooklyn Heights. "That's the Gowanus Heights," he said. It was a long ridge of hills. Okay, so let's take a look at this map that they're giving us. Here's the tip of New York City, the southern tip of Manhattan. All of this kind of swirly stuff that looks like clouds is supposed to be the East River. And now here's Brooklyn Heights. And they're talking about putting their cannons all across Brooklyn Heights. And what they're avoiding is the British being able to put their cannons here because they don't want them to be able to shoot at New York City. Captain Marsh is talking about this, the Gowanus Heights, which is a line of trees right here. The British are somewhere on the other side of this ridge, and they have to cross the hill of Gowanus Heights to get to our fort. But we already have 3,000 men guarding those hills when the British try to cross. Paul chimed in. "We'll blast them right back to England." Captain Marsh cracked a tiny smile. "Or at least back to Staten Island." The Redcoats and the Hessians, who made it to the forts, would face dozens of cannons. Thousands of Americans would be shooting at them from trenches protected by the tall dirt walls. "It'll be like Bunker Hill," Samuel said with a hopeful smile. "That's right," Captain Marsh said, the certainty gleaming in his eyes. The men cheered. They're sounding really sure of themselves. I wonder if they're getting too sure of themselves. Several nights passed, and Brooklyn stayed mostly quiet. On the night of August 26th, soldiers from different companies gathered around the campfires. They roasted hunks of pork on sharpened sticks. They insulted the British and called the Hessians foul names Nate would never repeat. To Nate, it almost seemed that the men were looking forward to a big party, not a bloody battle. They sang songs, including one that Nate had never heard before. It had a bright and catchy tune, but words that made no sense at all. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. One man played along on a little twinkling flute called a fife. Paul, Martin, and Samuel all sang along. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. What's a Yankee Doodle? Nate asked, raising his voice up over the singing and knee slapping. It's what the British call us, Martin said. They say the Americans are a bunch of Yankee Doodles, country folks who don't know how to fight. The British made up this song to tease us in battle, Paul added. So why are we singing it? Nate asked. This made no sense at all. Because at Bunker Hill, we showed them what a bunch of Yankee Doodles can do, Samuel said. We stole the name and the song. Nate smiled. Now he got it. The Americans took the British insult and turned it into a battle song. The singing went on until a blaring trumpet called the men to attention. 3 men appeared. The man in the center was very tall and wore a blue uniform. The man leaped to their feet. It was General Washington. The general stood quietly for a moment as the men gathered around him. A hush came over the camp. Even the grumpiest and sleepiest of the men stood straight up. They brushed the dust from their shirts and straightened their caps. Nate stood extra tall. The moment has come, General Washington began. The enemy has landed, and now the honor and success of America depend on you. His voice was calm, but powerful. He told them that a great battle was coming. He reminded the men what they were fighting for freedom, for their new country. The world will soon learn what a few brave men fighting for their own land can do. His words seemed to rise up into the air, and Nate knew he'd never forget the sound of the general's voice. Most of all, Nate would remember the feeling of being almost lifted up off the ground by nothing more than words. General Washington didn't speak for long, but even hours later, his voice seemed to echo through the camp. After the general left, the men settled down in their tents. Nate quickly fell asleep. Just after dawn, the sound of American alarm cannons boomed through the fort. Paul poked his head into Nate's tent. His eyes were flashing with excitement. The British are trying to cross the Gowanus Heights. The Battle of Brooklyn was about to begin. Chapter 14. August 27th, 9 a.m., Brooklyn, New York. The men of the Connecticut 5th were ordered to help guard the Gowanus Heights. Days before, Captain Marsh had told Nate that he would stay inside the fort for as long as they were in Brooklyn. You're not a soldier, he said. I don't want you on the battlefield. But that morning, 22 men in the Connecticut 5th were too sick to march. There were not enough men to carry ammunition and other supplies to the ridge. Nate, the captain said, I need you to march with us to the camp, and then you'll return here to the fort." They were taking the place of some Philadelphia soldiers who had been on duty there for 3 days straight. "You'll march back here with the Pennsylvania men." "Yes, sir," Nate said. "Anything happens, we all get ourselves back to the fort. You hear?" "Yes, sir." Gruesome pictures flashed through Nate's mind as he thought of stepping out of the fort. Exploding cannonballs, gut-smashing musket balls, bayonets dripping with blood. But a rush of pride swept Nate's fears away. Captain Marsh was counting on Nate. Paul helped Nate load up large knapsacks with extra ammunition cartridges. He was unusually quiet. He didn't like the idea of Nate leaving the fort. "You follow me," Paul said as they're lining up, "and stay close." Nate nodded. He took a place in line between Paul and Samuel, and they all set out into the wilds of Brooklyn. They marched along a narrow road under a sunny sky. The road cut through fields and meadows. They passed a deserted farm. The house was boarded up and there was not a person or animal in sight. In the yard was a big tree, with a wooden swing hanging from a branch. Nate could imagine Theo shrieking happily as he flew up and down. Nate felt the familiar ache of missing Theo. He also thought about the family that had built up that farm. Where had they all gone? Would they ever be able to come back? For the first time, it really hit Nate. This war wasn't just about King George and soldiers on battlefields. Regular people would lose their homes. Others would lose far more, their family members and friends. Even if the Americans won, some people would never be able to get back what they had lost. The road took them up a hill, and soon they were in the woods. They had reached the Gowanus Heights. There were a group of American soldiers standing guard along the way, but not as many as Nate would have expected. They turned off the road and walked along the ridge. The thickening woods made it hard to see more than just a few yards ahead, and all was very quiet. And then, boom! Boom! Two sharp cannon blasts shook the ground. Nate froze. Samuel whipped around. "That's strange," he said. His eyes narrowed with worry. "Those cannons were shot from this side of the ridge." Samuel scanned the woods. "The Americans don't have big cannons this far from the forts. The British aren't supposed to be anywhere near here." But they were, and they had the high ground. Crack! 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 Musket fire blasted them from the hill just above. A ball streaked right by Nate's ear. Looking up, Nate saw flashes of red between the trees up on the hill. "Redcoats! Take cover!" Captain Marsh shouted. Nate threw himself down into the dirt and covered his head with his hands. More shots exploded. Crack! Samuel cried out. Nate peeked up just in time to see him crumple to his knees. Samuel's hands flew up to his chest. Blood gushed from between his fingers. Nate saw it all so clearly, but he couldn't believe it was happening. All he could think was, "No! No! 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 No!" The life drained from Samuel's face. His body seemed to melt to the ground. Nate sprang up and rushed for Samuel, but the redcoats were shooting again. Crack! Nate dove back behind the tree. Captain Marsh's voice shouted out orders. Prepare! The Connecticut 5th men aimed their muskets. Crack! 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 Then they dropped to their knees and reloaded, exactly as they had practiced in their drill. But this was not a drill. Nate shook himself out of his shock. Samuel's musket was lying on the ground. He'd spent hours teaching Nate how to use it, and now Nate knew what Samuel would have expected him to do. Nate grabbed the musket. The wooden handle was still warm from Samuel's hands. Oh, man. That was a lot. 11 years old going through this. Can you imagine how scared Nate must feel? I feel scared for him. You're going to come to your chapter 13 and 14 discussion questions. What was the importance of Brooklyn in the war? What is Captain Marsh's plan to defend Brooklyn? What song did the British make up to tease the Americans? Why did the Americans steal the name and the song? What effect did Washington speaking have on Nate? And chapter 14. Why did the captain need Nate to march with them to the camp? Why did Nate do as the captain asked, even though he was scared? What did Nate realize the results of the war would be? How did the British surprise attack the Americans? And why did Nate grab the musket? When you're finished with your discussion questions, either send them to me in a document or take a picture and email them to me. And then for homework, you're going to take your I Survive chapter 10 through 14 quiz. So these questions are just based on chapters 10 to 14. So make sure you're looking back in your chapters for the answers. Again, you can highlight and write on this document and email it back to me, or you can just write 1 through 8 on a piece of loose leaf and take a picture and send it to me. Either one is acceptable. I will see you tonight on Zoom, and we will discuss chapters and our quiz. See you tonight. Bye, guys.